Ever get that feeling, like you're swimming in a sea of ideas,
Yeah.
always kind of searching for that deeper meaning, that click where everything kind of falls into place?
I think anyone with a philosophical mind, they know exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. And that's exactly the spirit we're bringing to today's deep dive.
Hmm.
We're tackling a thinker who really wrestled with those big questions, Bonaventure.
Bonaventure Bagnaregio, yeah. A fascinating figure from the 13th century.
And this one is especially for you, actually. You mentioned being intrigued by how philosophy, faith, reason all kind of intertwine.
And honestly, you couldn't ask for a better case study than Bonaventure. This guy who's right in the thick of it.
Yeah, he wasn't just some, armchair philosopher. The sources you send over the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy stuff paints a pretty vivid picture.
Totally. Active from, let's see, around 1221 to 1274. He was a Franciscan friar, a leading scholar at the University of Paris, which, by the way, was like the place to be for intellectual debate back
A
then.
real hub of thought, huh?
Oh, absolutely. And later on, he even headed up the entire Franciscan order. So we're talking about someone deeply embedded in both the philosophical and religious landscape of his time. And of course, there's his most famous work, The Journey of the Mind into God.
Which, from what I've read, it's not just a theological treatise, it's a philosophical exploration too, right?
Right. It shows how deeply intertwined those two were for Bonaventure.
So for this deep dive, we're aiming for clarity. What are Bonaventure's core ideas? How does he connect philosophy, faith, and theology?
And crucially, how does he build those arguments for God's existence? Because let's be real, that's a question that's intrigued philosophers for centuries.
Big time. And that's where those aha moments come in. Those insights that really resonate with a philosophical mind. We want to deliver those without, getting lost in the weeds.
Absolutely. The sources are rich. They dive into his life, his interactions with heavyweights like Aristotle, Augustine, Plato.
The all-star lineup of philosophy.
But we got to focus on what he brought to the table, especially his views on creation, how we understand things, how the human intellect works, and those intricate arguments for God he built.
Okay, so jumping right in, if I'm coming at this purely as a philosopher, where does Bonaventure fit? I noticed even in the sources, there are different takes.
Ah, yes, the where does he belong debate.
Hmm.
Classic philosophical dilemma.
Right. Some say he's basically an Augustinian theologian. Others see him as like taking those Augustinian ideas and building a whole philosophy within theology.
And then there's the camp that's like, well, he tried to be an Aristotelian but didn't quite get there.
So where do you land? What's your read on Bonaventure's philosophical identity?
It's tricky, easy to just slap a label on him, but Bonaventure, he kind of defies easy categorization.
A true independent thinker.
You got it. The Augustinian influence is definitely there, no doubt. The focus on inner experience, the role of divine illumination and understanding. But Bonaventure wasn't just parroting Augustine. He was a product of his time.
Immersed in all those new ideas swirling around, especially at the University of Paris.
Exactly. And one of the biggest things at that time, Aristotle. He'd been kind of rediscovered, and his ideas were causing, well, let's say a stir.
So Bonaventure, he's picking up on this Aristotelian wave.
Oh, he's diving right in. He's using those classic Aristotelian tools, categories, those building blocks of how we understand things. The transcendentals being unity, truth, goodness, those fundamental concepts that underpin reality.
Okay, I'm following. Those are pretty abstract though, right?
They are, but they're crucial for how Bonaventure understands, well, everything. Then you got Aristotle's framework of causality, the efficient cause, the final cause, the material cause, the formal cause, and that all-important distinction between potentiality and actuality.
That's quite the toolkit. But if he's not trying to be Aristotle, then what's he doing with it?
He's using those tools to build something unique, something that fits with his own vision, which was ultimately fundamentally theological. The sources are right to point out that he wasn't on the same path as, say, Aquinas.
Aquinas, who is all about trying to mesh Aristotle with Christian theology in this huge systematic way.
Exactly. Bonaventure was on a different track. He takes those Aristotelian principles, but he draws his own conclusions from them, conclusions shaped by his Franciscan worldview.
So for a philosopher today, the key is to see Bonaventure as someone weaving those Aristotelian threads into a distinctly Franciscan tapestry.
Beautifully put. It's not just Aristotle. It's Aristotle filtered through the lens of faith, through that Franciscan emphasis on love and humility.
Okay, that That makes sense. And it sounds like philosophy wasn't just some abstract game for Bonaventure. It was a tool, something vital for understanding and explaining matters of faith.
100%. I mean, think about his letter to an unknown master. He talks about philosophy's role in reaching truth, in shooting down errors.
Especially when it comes to faith.
Exactly. He believed that faith comes from God, right? Divine revelation, that's the source. But reason, philosophical thinking, it's like a partner, helping us unpack those truths, make them clear, and defend them when they're challenged.
So it's not about reason telling faith what to do. It's more like reason helping faith shine brighter.
That's it. A dynamic duo working together. And this leads to a really interesting point about how Bonaventure saw theology itself.
The outline mentions he called it a science, but he meant that in a very specific Aristotelian way.
Right. It's not science like we think of it today, with test tubes and beakers. When Bonaventure said science, he meant episteme. That's the Greek term for systematic knowledge. Knowledge built on solid principles, on showing how things are connected through cause and effect.
Okay, so he's taking that rigorous analytical approach and applying it to theology.
Exactly. He's treating those truths revealed in Scripture like a scientist would treat the laws of nature. He wants to understand them deeply, to see the underlying causes, the why behind the what.
So if theology's a science for Bonaventure, what are its fundamental causes? I mean, we've got the four from Aristotle: efficient, final, formal, and material.
Good catch. And he actually lays this out beautifully in his commentary on Book 1 of the Sentences. Shall we break it down?
Let's do it. Efficient cause first. What gives theology its start?
Well, in Aristotle's world, the efficient cause is the thing that brings something about, right? So for Bonaventure, when you're talking about a work of theology, like, say, Peter Lombard's Sentences, which he commented on, or even his own writings, the efficient cause is the author.
The person doing the thinking, the writing?
You got it. It's the human intellect wrestling with these theological ideas. But here's the key distinction. Bonaventure makes it clear that faith itself, that comes directly from God. Grace, that's the source. But philosophy, theology, those are human activities. We're using our minds, our God-given minds, to explore those truths.
So there's human agency involved, even though the ultimate source is divine. Okay, that's a subtle but important point. Now, final cause. What's theology's ultimate goal?
Good question. And for Bonaventure, it goes beyond just knowledge for knowledge's sake. He's not just trying to build a theoretical system. And it's not solely about doing good deeds either.
So it's not purely theoretical, not purely practical. What's the sweet spot then?
He sees the final cause of theology as this beautiful blend of understanding and love. He uses the term Christian affection, which encompasses love, charity, that wholehearted devotion.
Like knowing about Christ's sacrifice isn't enough. It has to move you, transform you.
Exactly. He wants that knowledge to be alive, to be infused with love and gratitude. So the ultimate goal of theology is wisdom. Not just knowing, but knowing in a way that makes you better, more loving, more like Christ.
Very Franciscan, that emphasis on love. Okay, so we've got the why of theology now, the how. The formal cause, what's the method, the approach?
This is where Aristotle's logic comes in handy. Bonaventure is all about argumentation, clear reasoning. Remember, he said the aim of theology is to promote the faith.
To clarify it, defend it, deepen it?
Precisely. He even says it can help confound those who oppose the faith, strengthen those who are wavering, and bring joy and deeper understanding to those who are firm in their beliefs.
So it's not just about winning arguments, it's about supporting and nourishing faith.
Exactly. And to explain how theology does all this, Bonaventure uses this really cool concept from Aristotle, subalternated sciences. He compares it to optics and geometry. Optics studies visible lines, right? But it depends on geometry, which studies lines in a more general, abstract way.
So optics is kind of subordinate to geometry, it gets its principles from it.
Exactly. And for Bonaventure, theology is subalternated to Scripture. Scripture provides the foundational truths revealed by God. And theology takes those truths and, through reasoning and argumentation, makes them clearer, defends them, explores their implications.
So Scripture is like the bedrock, and theology builds upon that foundation, making it more intellectually accessible.
You got it. It takes that revealed truth and, through reason, brings it into the realm of human understanding. Okay, last but not least, the material cause. What's theology's subject matter? What's it actually about?
Right, because Aristotle's sciences, they each focus on a specific type of thing. But theology, it aims to understand God, who's beyond all categories.
Right. So how do you pin that down? Bonaventure considers a few options, things like things and signs, or Christ as head and members. But ultimately, he settles on this. The object of belief, credibly, in Latin.
So anything that's believed,
Mm-hmm.
anything related to faith, that's fair game for theology.
Exactly. It gives theology this incredible scope. It can encompass all realities and all the intellectual questions that come with faith. And remember that key phrase Bonaventure keeps using. He says this object of belief, it passes over into intelligibility by the addition of reasoning.
There it is again. That emphasis on reason's role in illuminating faith.
It's fundamental to his whole approach. And it's not just theoretical. If you look at his disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity, you see this in action.
How so?
He structures it so that each question gets two treatments. First, he approaches it purely through philosophical arguments, reason alone. Then, in the next section, he tackles the same question, but this time using the authority of Scripture and faith.
So he's showing both sides, reason and revelation working in tandem.
Exactly. And then there's on retracing the arts to theology. That whole work is about showing how even the liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, all those, they point toward theological truths.
He's seeing a deep connection between all forms of knowledge, ultimately leading back to God.
Yes, a beautiful harmony resonating throughout the universe of knowledge.
Okay, we've laid the groundwork. Now, the main event. Bonaventure's arguments for the existence of God. The outline mentions his collations on the Hexameron as a key text here.
Right, the Hexameron. It's a commentary on the 6 days of creation in Genesis. But Bonaventure, being Bonaventure, he uses it as a springboard for some serious philosophical and spiritual reflection.
He's not just doing biblical exegesis, he's bringing in the big guns of metaphysics.
Totally. He points out that even those ancient philosophers, the ones who relied only on their natural reason, they figured out some key things. The universe has a beginning, it has an end, and it has what he calls an exemplar cause.
And that exemplar cause, that's God, right? But what exactly does it mean?
It's a crucial concept for Bonaventure. He's saying God didn't just randomly create stuff. God has these perfect ideas, these archetypes within his own mind. They're like blueprints for creation.
So everything in the universe is a reflection, a copy of those divine ideas.
Exactly. They serve as the model, the pattern, the formal cause that guides creation. And to understand this better, Bonaventure brings in the transcendentals being unity, truth, goodness. They're not like ordinary qualities.
Because ordinary qualities, they always imply some limitation. Like a red apple, it's red but not all colors.
Right. But the transcendentals, they apply to God absolutely, perfectly. They capture his infinite nature, his perfection. And it's through these lenses that Bonaventure approaches the question of God's existence.
And that's where those three Neoplatonic roots to God come in, right? The ideological, the illuminationist, and the ontological.
Spot on. And unlike Augustine, who mainly stuck to one, Bonaventure explores all three.
Okay, quick rundown for those of us who aren't, Neoplatonism experts.
Sure thing. The ateological route, it's all about causality. You start with the world, you see things happening, effects. And you trace that back to a first cause, the ultimate source, which is God, like a cosmological argument.
Okay, cause and effect makes sense. What about illuminationism?
Illuminationism, it's more inward focused. It's about how we know, how we understand. It says that God is the ultimate source of that light of reason that lets us grasp truth. So it's looking at the very act of knowing.
Fascinating. And the ontological argument, that one's pretty famous.
Oh, yeah, the one Anselm's known for. It's about trying to prove God's existence just from the very idea of God. Like, if you truly understand what God is, you can't conceive of him not existing. It's a mind bender for sure.
Okay, so Bonaventure, he tackles all three of these. Let's start with the illumination argument.
Yeah.
The outline says it's grounded in the transcendental truth and takes inspiration from Augustine's Confessions.
Right. Augustine talks about seeing this unchangeable light in his soul, a light that revealed eternal truths. Bonaventure takes that image and turns it into a philosophical argument.
So, if I understand correctly, he's basically saying that if we can know things with certainty, that certainty has to come from God, because God is the ultimate source of truth.
That's the gist of it. He argues that this knowledge of truth, it's imprinted on every human soul. We participate in that divine truth. But here's the thing. Bonaventure isn't saying we directly perceive God when we understand something.
So it's not like, boom, sudden mystical vision. It's more subtle.
Much more. It's what's called moderate illuminationism. He says we need both divine and created causes to know things. God sets the standard for truth, and he also enables our minds to understand.
So it's a collaboration, a partnership, God provides the framework,
Yeah.
and our minds work within that framework.
Exactly. And he breaks down the created causes into four parts. You've got the material cause, that's like the raw material, the sensory data we take in. Then there's the efficient cause, the agent intellect, which takes that data and abstracts universal concepts from it.
So, like, I see a bunch of different dogs, and my mind goes, aha, dogness.
You got it. Then there's the formal cause, which is the essence of the thing itself, what makes it that thing. And finally, there's the final cause, which is truth itself, the goal of knowing.
Okay, so all these parts working together is how we get knowledge. But why is divine illumination necessary?
Because Bonaventure says those created causes, on their own, they can't explain the certainty of knowledge, especially when it comes to universals, those abstract concepts and inductive reasoning, where we go from specific observations to general conclusions.
So God steps in and provides that bedrock of certainty.
Exactly. He guarantees that our knowledge is reliable, that we're not just making things up. The content of our knowledge, that comes from our interaction with the world and our own thinking, but the certainty, the trustworthiness of it, that comes from God.
That's a pretty elegant way to put it. Okay, so that's illuminationism. Now on to the ideological argument. Source says Bonaventure considered this one even more certain. Why is that?
Because this one starts with the world outside us, not our inner experience, but what he calls ontological truth, the truth of being itself.
So we're shifting from the mind to reality itself.
You got it. And his core argument is this. We see things in the world that clearly depend on something else for their existence. They participate in being, but they don't have being in themselves.
Like a plant needs sunlight, soil, water to exist.
Perfect example. It has being, but it's contingent dependent.
Hmm.
So Bonaventure says if there are things that have being by participation, there must be something that has being by its own essence, something that's not dependent on anything else.
And that something is God, the ultimate source of being.
Precisely. And to flesh this out, he uses his own doctrine of being. He distinguishes between existere, which is like having a separate independent existence, and esse, which is the act of being itself.
Okay, so existere is like being a thing in the world, a physical object.
And esse is the principle of being itself, the energy that makes something exist. For Bonaventure, all created things, they have a limited participated esse. They depend on something else for their existence.
So they point towards a source, a giver of being.
Exactly. And that's where the participation premise comes in. It says that if something has a quality by participation, that quality must exist fully and perfectly in its source.
So like a drop of water has wetness, but the ocean, that's where wetness exists in its pure form.
Perfect analogy. And when you apply this to being, you get to God. God is the ultimate exemplar of being, the source from which all other beings derive their existence. He's the I am, the one whose very essence is to exist.
And this line of thinking, Bonaventure says, it leads straight to the ontological argument.
Right. It sets the stage for thinking about God's existence, not just from observing the world, but from the very concept of being itself.
Okay, so on to the ontological argument. This is the one that really gets philosophers going. And the sources say Bonaventure was the first major thinker in the 13th century to really grapple with it.
He took it seriously, that's for sure. And he approached it through an Aristotelian lens, thinking about different types of foundational principles. Aristotle talked about self-evident axioms and necessary postulates.
And Bonaventure, he saw the knowledge of God's existence as kind of like an axiom.
In a way, yes. He agrees with Anselm that when you really get what God is, the idea that he doesn't exist, it just feels wrong, contradictory. Like, our minds naturally recognize God's existence. He even suggests that if God exists, our intellects can't be truly deficient in understanding him. We can't actually conceive of him not existing.
But obviously people do deny God's existence, so something's going wrong somewhere.
Right, and Bonaventure recognizes that. He says our knowledge of God, it's limited, imperfect. We're finite beings trying to grasp the infinite, and that can lead to doubt.
So we have this innate inclination towards recognizing God, but our limited minds can get in the way. What's the solution?
He offers two, faith and reason. Within faith, believing in God is a given. It's revealed truth, accepted on authority. But Bonaventure also wants to make a philosophical case to show that God's existence can be established as a necessary postulate, a foundational principle of reality. And he adapts Anselm's argument to do this.
So he's taking that ontological intuition and giving it a rigorous philosophical structure.
Exactly, and his version has two parts, the negative moment and the positive moment.
Sounds intriguing. Break it down for me.
The negative moment, it's about showing that the idea of God not existing is absurd. He says it's like saying something that's completely one, completely undivided, somehow doesn't exist. It's a contradiction, like saying something is and isn't at the same time.
So you can't think of God as non-existent without running into a logical brick wall.
Right. And then the positive moment kicks in. This is where he argues that God's essence, what God is, includes existence. It's not something separate, it's built in.
So if you truly grasp what God is, you automatically grasp that he exists.
Precisely. And he uses the transcendentals to make this connection. Remember, those are being, unity, truth, goodness. In his commentary on the sentences, he focuses on truth. He says the highest, most perfect truth, which is pure unity, can't be separated from being. They're two sides of the same coin.
So God, as the source of all truth, must also be the source of all being.
Exactly. Then, on the mystery of the Trinity, he uses good. He says the best, most complete being, ens completissimum, has to have existence as part of its perfection. It's like a fundamental requirement. And that's where his famous, if God is God, God is phrase comes from.
That's a real zinger, that one. Gets right to the point.
It does. And finally, in the journey of the mind to God, he zeroes in on being itself. He says, esse divinum, God's being, is also esse purissimum, pure being, with no hint of non-being. It's the absolute fullness of existence.
Okay, so he's gone through true, good, and now being as ways to show that God's existence is inherent in his very nature.
Exactly. He's using this fundamental concept to show that God's existence isn't just probable or possible, it's absolutely necessary.
And what about that famous objection to the ontological argument, the one about the perfect island?
Ah, yes, Guanilo's Island. Bonaventure had a clever response to that. He distinguished between categorical being and transcendental being. An island, it belongs to a category, right? It's a limited, created thing. An ens defectivum, he calls it, a being with limitations.
So you can imagine a perfect island, but it's still just an island. It's not perfect in an absolute sense.
Exactly. But God, he's not limited by any category. He's transcendental. He encompasses all perfections without limit. So the logic that might seem to work for a perfect island, it doesn't apply to God. God's being is on a whole other level.
Okay, that makes sense. So to wrap up this whole discussion about knowing God's existence, it sounds like Bonaventure saw this knowledge as accessible in multiple ways, not just through one airtight proof.
Absolutely. He believed it's something woven into the very fabric of reality, something we can grasp through different lenses. It's like a multifaceted jewel, reflecting light from different angles.
So he sees it as a demonstrable conclusion, something you can reach through reasoned argument, both through the illumination argument, focusing on our inner experience, and the etiological argument, looking at the world around us.
Right. But it's also like a common axiom, something we implicitly recognize when we see the world and how it points towards something beyond itself.
And finally, it's a postulate, a foundational principle that we can grasp, both through philosophical reasoning, like the ontological argument, and through faith, accepting God's revelation.
For Bonaventure, knowing God wasn't some esoteric hidden knowledge. It was right there, embedded in our experience, in our thinking, in the very structure of reality.
So through this deep dive, you, with your philosophical mind, you can really appreciate how Bonaventure brought it all together. He combined philosophical rigor with deep faith, weaving insights from ancient thinkers with his own unique vision.
He offers a powerful model for how reason and belief can work together, each illuminating the other. And for a mind like yours, always searching for those deeper truths, Bonaventure's ideas are a rich source of insight.
He tackles those big questions about knowledge, being, the divine. And he does it in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and spiritually profound. It's a real invitation to think deeply, to consider those fundamental mysteries that have always captivated philosophers.
Exactly. And if you want to go even deeper, to hear it straight from Bonaventure himself, I'd highly recommend checking out The Journey of the Mind to God. It's a classic for a reason.
And speaking of journeys, I'm curious, after this deep dive, after exploring Bonaventure's ideas about creation, about God as the ultimate source and exemplar, how do you see the world around you differently? Do you find yourself noticing those echoes of the divine, those hints of something more in the everyday things?
Because that's what Bonaventure challenges us to do. To see the world with new eyes, to find those traces of the transcendent in the ordinary. It's a journey worth taking, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing Bonaventure to our attention. This deep dive has been a real treat, intellectually stimulating and spiritually enriching. We hope it sparks some new ideas, some new avenues of exploration for you.
And we hope you'll join us again for another deep dive into the world of ideas. There's always more to discover, more to explore.